Okay. Okay, everyone, thank you for coming. Welcome to our 2:30 press conference. So we are going to have two press conferences back to back covering new research on hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. So our first panel is going to start here at 2:30, then we'll take a break from 3:15 and then start again at 3:30 with our second panel. So I'm going to introduce Kerry Emanuel from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you, and welcome all of you. This session is concerning principally the hurricanes, the tragic events of the last few seasons. Three of our panelists today are going to talk directly about hurricanes and hurricane risk and how that risk may be evolving. And the fourth is going to tell you about the most amazing rain gauge you've ever heard of, certainly the most amazing I've ever heard of. I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly just to save time, and then they'll come up one at a time afterwards. So first up today is going to be Mike Wehner, who's at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and is going to, sorry, Berkeley, yes, Berkeley. Thank you for correcting me about that. Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And he's going to be talking about a particular method of estimating the risk of events like Hurricane Harvey and how they might be evolving over time. Then we'll have John Nielsen-Gammon, who is at Texas A&M University and is also the Texas State climatologist. He'll be talking about the interesting aspects of the stalling of Harvey, which was one of its features that led to such catastrophic rainfall. Then we're going to hear from Adrian Borsa of Scripps Institute of Oceanography, who will be telling you about this fantastic rain gauge. And finally, Karin van der Wiel from the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute in Bilt, Netherlands. Let me just say that one of the things I'd like you all to realize, which I only realized recently, is that in an amazingly short period of time since Hurricane Harvey, three research groups working independently, as far as I know, on the risks of rainfall of Harvey's magnitude and how they're evolving over time because of anthropogenic climate change came to more or less the same conclusion about that. And I think that's a very powerful result. So without further ado, let's go to Mike.
Thank you, Kerry. I used to be at Livermore, but I've been at Berkeley for a while now. Yes. So the first thing I have to say is these are being interpreted as my scientific opinions and not necessarily reflective of any policies of the government or any other institutions that I'm associated with. So to go right to the conclusions, our study that appears today in the Geophysical Research Letters shows that, our analysis shows that anthropogenic climate change, human-induced climate change, likely increased Hurricane Harvey's total rainfall in this tight region around Houston by at least 19%, with a best estimate of 37%. In other words, climate change increased precipitation during the storm by 37%. This is substantially larger than we would have expected, that I expected prior to doing the work, where thermodynamical arguments would have said maybe 6 or 7% increases caused by a degree of attributable warming in the Gulf of Mexico. We further wrote that anthropogenic climate change likely increased the chances of the observed rainfall, the measured rainfall, by a factor of at least 3.5, with a best estimate of about 10. Now, attribution studies are an exercise in causality. The question is what caused the precipitation, not causes of cyclogenesis or things of that nature. We use a statistical model to do this. This is what causal theorists would call Granger causality. I could go into that in detail if people are interested. But basically, we did a statistical model with two different statistical covariates chosen to separate the human and natural influences. So the human influence was represented by atmospheric carbon dioxide, and the natural influence by El Nino, as El Nino is associated with Atlantic hurricane activities. And we asked the question, what would the precipitation of Harvey's rarity be with 1950 values of carbon dioxide, but 2017 values of El Nino characterizing the state of the ocean? And this isolates the human effect. Now, in all these studies, I think all three of these studies, and I'll have a summary slide on that in a minute, there is a major caveat that Harvey was a essentially unforeseen, black swan kind of event. And all three studies calculated it to have even an exceedingly low probability, even in 2017. And so how could we expect any analysis of such a unique event to using data from the past, where it had nothing like this had ever happened before, to be believable? And one of the things that I think helps is that we found that these statements on the changes in increased risk are remarkably stable to the amount of precipitation that would be measured. And so over a range from 300 to 1,000 millimeters, the observed range was around 700. We find that this lower bound of 3.5 is quite stable to that. Now, I just added this to say that the three papers, ours in GRL, Karin's in Environmental Research Letters, and Kerry's in the Proceeding of the National Academy, which appeared a few weeks ago, were completely independent and use different methods and data, but come to the same basic conclusion. Ours is the risk increased by a factor of 10 and precipitation increased by 34%. The Dutch study said the risk increased by 3 times with a precipitation increase of 15%. And Kerry's is a little bit different, but the numbers are completely consistent. His was the risk increased by 6 times since 1990. And so I think that the fact that the 3 papers come to perhaps different numbers, but we are all within each other's uncertainty ranges, well within them, leads confidence to the statement that there was a significant human influence on the amount of precipitation that was produced by Hurricane Harvey. So thank you. I'm not sure how to find the next one, though. He'll do it back there.
All right, my name is John Nielsen-Gammon. As you heard, I'm the Texas State climatologist, and I'm a professor at Texas A&M University. And we tried to look at one of the factors that was presumed to make Harvey such an exceptional event, which was its unusual motion. So Harvey stalled and then moved again, and the way we're going to characterize its motion is by how big an area it occupied during a 3-day period in which it stalled. If you think of this as a corral, and how big that corral is a measure of how much the storm actually did stall. And what I'll show you is that Harvey is not unique in that context, but it was a very rare event. And the events that are comparable to Harvey are some of the most impactful hurricanes in the climate record. So, if we look at Harvey's track, this is what the corral circle looks like in this case. It occupies the position of the storm over a 3-day period centered on the morning of August 27th. And you'll note that this is not the location that experienced the heaviest rain. That was off to the northeast, mainly because it was on the east side of the storm that the winds were from the south, pumping in tropical moisture. And but the fact that the storm was quasi-stationary meant that that rain area was also quasi-stationary over several days. Now, in terms of all the storms that stalled close to the coast and had relatively intense winds, we limit it to storms very close to the coast within 100 kilometers on land and 50 kilometers offshore for the center of that corral. We get a total of 4 storms in the hurricane database going back to 1865. Harvey is one of them. The other 3 that were more intense and came to more of a standstill were Hurricane Mitch, which in 1998 killed 11,000 persons estimated. Hurricane Flora, which in 1963 killed about 7,000 individuals. And then a storm called the Cyclone of the 5 Days, which affected western Cuba in 1910. So in this list, we have a total of 4 storms. That includes 2 of the 5 deadliest storms going back to the discovery of the Americas, and one of the 2 most costly storms It may still prove to be the costliest on record. It's rivaling Katrina in that regard. Of course, the consequence of its stalling is high amounts of precipitation. Turns out that storms that move very relatively little also are the ones that set the records for storm total precipitation across much of the region. The record for the United States was set by Harvey, 1,500 millimeters, or more than 1.5 meters of rainfall. The Georgia storm record is in this group. That was Cobblestorm Alberto. Alabama's rainfall record set by Storm Danny, or Hurricane Danny at the time. Florida's record by a storm in 1950. And Cuba's record, that was Florida that I mentioned back in 1963, which produced a gauge measurement of more than 100 inches of rainfall. I've slipped in a slide from our moderator, Kerry. He was a collaborator on our project. We were looking at whether there had been a systematic change over time. He diagnosed the changes in rainfall based on his synthetic storm tracking algorithm. And over the century projection from the later part of the 20th century, later part of the 21st, he estimates an increase at a factor of 10 in the likelihood of rainfall amounts comparable to Harvey, caused by tropical cyclones. And that's a combination of the availability of moisture increasing in the warming world and also a possible contribution from the duration of the storm. In terms of the number of storms stalling along the coast, this is what it looks like over the past century and a half. In the United States, which is the blue bars, and in Mexico and Central America, there's been an increase over this period in the record. These are the storms we expect to actually be the best observed because their coastlines were populated during this period. It wasn't relying on satellite observations. So whether this is statistical randomness, what the role is of the climate record in producing a perceived trend, or whether this actually reflects an ongoing trend due to climate change is yet to be determined. So I'll just leave with a summary of the results here, that such storms tend to be extremely impactful, both with loss of life and damage. They are fairly rare. We saw 4 storms in the past 150 plus years, which means you only see one every few decades. And this one happened to stall close to a major metropolitan area. And the number of stalls along the coast has increased in the Atlantic Basin in recent decades. Lastly, a caveat, this research has not yet been peer reviewed, so it's still preliminary research. Thank you.
Great, so we heard this talk really characterized as a new type of rain gauge, and I'd like to say at the outset, it's not just a gauge of the rainfall that comes in, but as we'll see, the recovery of a region from flooding, which is something that's very difficult to observe. So I'd like to call out first my co-authors, David Menson and Tony Van Dam. The great thing about science is you can work with great people who are also your friends, and I would characterize both my co-authors as good friends. Actually, how do I go back? There we go. So since this is about water, we start with a picture of Harvey rainfall. This is on August 25th as Harvey is making landfall on the Gulf Coast. This is precipitation colored according to the intensity of the rainfall. And if we take this from the top left to the bottom right, what we see is, as was just characterized earlier, this is a storm that is churning along the Gulf Coast from top left to bottom right over 7 or 8 days, dropping a stupendous amount of rain. It exits on September 1st, and if we actually look at where the rain, the clouds are sort of spread out over a very large region, the primary rainfall, however, is concentrated very close, and there's a little bit of a lag. So it's concentrated very close to the coast right here, within about 100 kilometers. An immense amount of water sitting right within about, right on the coast. And if you total all this up, you get, depending on the estimate, somewhere between 24 and 34 trillion gallons of water. To put this in perspective, that is about the annual West Antarctic ice sheet melt, or about half the recent California drought in terms of total volume of water. So one storm dropped this much water in an extremely concentrated area, which is why we're talking about this hurricane. So I'm here to tell you about a different kind of way of looking at this storm and looking at the rainfall. And the idea is precipitation from a storm arrives. It's actually, the water is a weight. It's a load on Earth's surface. And even though you don't see it, we don't perceive it with our senses, Earth actually deforms elastically to this load arriving. So I show it there as this water. So the hurricane, for instance, dumps a lot of water. The entire Earth deforms, but the greatest is there's substance underneath the load. The highest amount of substance is directly underneath it. And if you have a very sensitive instrument like a GPS station, and we have many in this region, it will actually record this subsidence. Think of it like you sitting on a mattress. It subsides or it depresses. When you get off it, it actually rebounds. That's exactly how the Earth is responding to water loads. And GPS, these permanent GPS stations, are able to see very, very small changes like these are, millimeter or centimeter level. So we've got a lot of GPS stations. These are stations that are processed by the University of Nevada, Reno. And we're going to call out one of them. This is ROD1. It's in the Houston area. This is a station on, this is not the most elegant or stable pillar, but for our kinds of work, this is perfect. We're just looking at a short period of time. And we're going to focus on the GPS stations that are these dots in this lower, sort of in the Gulf region. And what I've done is taken for each of these stations the actual vertical motion over the 3 months that span Harvey. And Harvey is this gray bar. That's when Harvey was dropping precipitation. So each of these lines is a GPS time series. The range is plus or minus 1¼ centimeters. So not much range, but the GPS are actually moving up and down. And you can see as Harvey arrives, there's a subsidence of the entire station network. It goes down, and on September 1st, when Harvey exits the area, there then starts to be this long recovery where all the stations are rising back up. And if we look at that, if we just take, let's say, September 1st and look at what that looks like spatially, the color scale here is light blue is 0. So these stations, these dark blue, have subsided. So that's a slice here on September 1st. If we go to the end of the recovery period on the 21st, so that's 3 weeks later, what we see is that most of the stations have come up. There's still some subsidence right around the central area of rainfall. Now, without going into the math, we can actually take this distribution of GPS station, sort of this subsidence, and convert it into the water load, the sort of layer of water on Earth's surface that is consistent with the subsidence. We do that here for September 1st. I'm showing you again for 3 weeks later, and what you see, so the color code here, orange are dry areas, blue are wet or heavily areas with a lot of water. And we get a layer of up to about 30, 40 centimeters thick of water at the highest that then disappears. And we don't just have these two dates. In fact, we have the water load for the entire period of record. And if we integrate all of the water that we have estimated that falls within this box, so this is the region of high rainfall, we get this red curve. And that is showing here, didn't show Harvey, but essentially from the start of Harvey up to September 1st, when the storm peaks, we get 127 gigatons of water. This is the equivalent of the high range of these independent estimates. So roughly half of California's drought delivered, all at once, and that's here. And then there's this long recovery where the water leaves the landscape. And what I'm showing you here, if you actually look at the rain gauges, the stream gauges of these rivers down in Texas, those all peak and then fall off really rapidly. So it's a very efficient drainage, moving the water out. What's going on here? Why is the GPS still showing a load? Well, this is essentially the difference between what runs off and what is just sitting in the landscape in terms of lakes or ponds or basins. And that takes a long time through evaporation and transpiration from plants to actually exit. So we're able not just to see this peak, but a completely unobservable part of the hydrological system. So quick takeaways. This top statement here is basically saying GPS is in fact a rain gauge. And what's amazing is that the GPS network that's built here is for surveying, it's for tectonics. It was built for an entirely different purpose, and yet it can be used for actually pulling together the water cycle and seeing all of that. And I think I will just leave you with that, and we can talk about it later. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for the AGU to let us present our work here. So I will give an overview of our paper results that were published today in Environmental Research Letters. And before I start, I would like to say that some of my co-authors are in the audience or present at AGU and would also be willing to answer some questions. Yes, so our study sets out to answer two questions. The first is how extreme or how rare was this event? And the second is, did climate change the odds of this event? And that second question is fundamentally different from the question, did climate change cause this event? So I'm going to answer whether or not the odds of an event like this have changed over time. And by the event, I want to say we look at the rainfall from Hurricane Harvey. So really the rainfall event is what we investigate here. These are our key points. So yes, it was a very extreme event. The 3-day rainfall total of 1,043 millimeters in Baytown, which is 41 inches, has a return time of at least 9,000 years in our estimates. And that's an annual chance of this occurring of 0.01%, so it's really, really small. And if we look at similar events on the whole of the US Gulf Coast, then we find that the probability has changed by a factor of 3, or equivalently the intensity, so the amount of water that fell, increased by 15%. And in between brackets over there, I have the 95% confidence interval, and in IPCC language that would be very likely. So very likely, it's between 1.5 and 5 times more likely now than in pre-industrial times. So in more detail into the two questions that we set out to answer. So our event definition was a 3-day rainfall sum. We chose this to match the main impact, which was flooding in the city of Houston, and we looked at the rain gauges or the stream gauges to see when they peaked and what rainfall fell before that. So that's the 3-day rainfall that we look at. And then locally, so in a very specific place, the return time is at least 9,000 years, so as I said before. But regionally, so if you look at the entire US Gulf Coast, this chance is bigger, so you have at least 1 in 100 years, or our best estimate, 800-year return period. Then the attribution aspect of our study, did climate change the odds of this? So we used 2 observational data sets based on rain gauges and 2 global climate models of high resolution. And then we do a trend detection, so a change, we look for a change over time. And in the climate models, we have 2 different experiments, one a world with climate change and one without. And then if there's a difference, we can attribute that to climate change. So the answer is yes, climate change did change the odds. As I said, we estimate it to be 3 times more likely now than in pre-industrial times with the uncertainty interval over there. And this is the result of human-caused climate change. And what that means for people living in this area is that in pre-industrial times, in 2,500 years, you expect about 1 of these storms, of these rainfall events to occur. But in present day, in the same period, there would be 3. So 3 times more likely means this. Yes, and so for the implications, I want to again emphasize that our study focuses on the rainfall hazard, but of course the primary impact was flooding, and flood risk depends on more than just rainfall, and so other drivers on the ground are also very important, and this is why we think it's very important that for flood mitigation you take into account this non-stationarity of the weather and the changing return periods. And so with that, I'll leave it here.
Okay, so now we'll open it up to questions from reporters in the room. Well, do we have any questions?
Michael, can you clarify the number? Is it 37? Is it 38? Is it 34 on your best estimate? Thank you.
It's 38. I might have it wrong in this slide.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Michael Grushko, National Geographic. Questions for Adrian. How sensitive is your rain gauge measurement to rainfalls that aren't on the extraordinary end of the scale, as we find with Harvey?
Yeah.
Okay, great question. So one thing, if you noticed in that last graph, there were a couple of peaks that were earlier in the load, the total load. We went back to find out what was actually going on, and in fact, these were supercell storms that were showing up elsewhere in the watershed. So going back, taking that ROD1, for instance, I can go back and show that, let's say, over the course of the year, each of the little blips that go down is associated either with a local rain event or one that's further away that's bigger.
Seth Bornstein, AP. Kerry, you and I have talked about this. This is all about Harvey. There were 2 other major hurricanes that hit the United States this season. I know it's easy to measure rain issues. Is there anything you can tell us about Irma and Maria, or just the combination of these 3 landfalling hurricanes, and any connection or lack thereof to anthropogenic warming?
Anybody want to go? Well, I'll try to break the ice, Seth. Maria and Irma did set some records. Irma was broke by a large margin the record for sustained Category 5 status anywhere in the world. Irma, I think, was the 2nd strongest tropical cyclone recorded in the Atlantic. So we really had an extraordinary season, and I think you put your finger on a weakness of the way we go about assessing hazards. That is, we tend, and I'm trying to think of exceptions and can't right now, to look at them one at a time. You know, what's the probability of a Harvey or a Maria? And we haven't addressed the societally important problem of clustering of events. We can. I think we have the tools to do that, but what's the probability of having 3 extraordinary events like that? And maybe you could even measure, what's the probability of having $250 billion of damage in one season, regardless of, how many events it took to do that. I think that's a kind of a blank spot. Maybe the other panelists would like to comment on that.
I can't comment on that, I'm afraid, but I do have, we did look at Maria and Irma with a different technique using regional modeling to do a hindcast attribution, is what I call it. And we did get some simulations finished in time for the meeting, but I'm not happy with them. They don't capture the rapid intensification, and I think we simply need more time. Kerry's right in that the amount of time since Harvey has been remarkably short, and the fact that we have any attribution studies, much less 3 on Hurricane Harvey, is pretty amazing. This kind of analysis is because of its importance and because of its difficulty, it really does need to take time.
But just 2 things to follow up. One with Kerry, when you talk about just sort of the importance of clustering. I mean, we had 11 years where, yes, there were major hurricanes, just not landfalling in the U.S. So this is a year where for the North America, it seems like you turn around and there's another disaster. Do you think this is more likely chance? Or is there something here? I mean, I guess I'm trying to get a sense of how is this clustering, you know, it's like earthquakes, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Or is there something, or is climate change or something else, AMOC or aerosol issues happening here? And then for Michael, you talk about rapid intensification. I mean, Irma, all of these were rapid intensifiers. Are we seeing more rapid intensification just in general?
Oh, I don't think we know that, do you?
No, I mean, I think, you know, our distant ancestors would have had a ready answer to that question. That is, that we're all sinners, and we're particularly bad this year. But the way scientists will approach the problem, the important problem you raise, is to first present a null hypothesis. The null hypothesis was a statistical accident. And you may remember Vern Sumi, who was the sort of father of modern satellite meteorology, used to demonstrate this at a restaurant by pouring salt into his palms and throwing the salt bodily in the air and letting it come down on the tablecloth. You should try it sometime. You know, I have a nice black tablecloth there. You can see all kinds of clustering and patterns in that. Your eye just picks them out. And they're there and they're not. I mean, there really are clusters, but they cluster by statistical accident, not by some mechanism. And so it takes a while to tease out true patterns in the data. And I'm quite sure you're going to see a lot of that going on for this season, as we did for the 2005 season. But we haven't done it yet. As Michael correctly points out, there hasn't been very much time elapsed.
But I do think it's fair to say that this, especially with precipitation, is, you know, what we expect, that, you know, as temperatures warm, extreme precipitations from all classes of storms will increase at least by this 6 or 7% from the thermodynamic constraints of Clausius-Clapeyron. I think the surprising thing here is the super Clausius-Clapeyron scaling of the greater than 6% per degree warming. And the literature is rapidly expanding on this. There are other studies on other classes of storms that are finding that this can happen. For me, that was a surprise. You know.
If I can just interject one more thing, I think it's very important for people to realize that in addition to the strong scientific consensus that Michael just talked about rain, which has been around for decades, this is not something we just arrived at in the last. There's been many predictions that hurricanes would rain more. There are also solid predictions and quite good agreement that the incidence of very high category hurricanes like Irma and Maria are going to go up. So in that sense, these storms of the season are a foretaste of our future unless we do something about our future.
So I just wanted to offer a slightly different perspective. One of the things that our GPS work has, so we haven't been looking at these storm events. We've been looking at much longer, sort of multi-annual or seasonal changes in water. The amount of water that comes in a storm is actually not, I mean, compared to, let's say, the seasonal flows, is fairly moderate. It's just, it comes all at once. So, you know, if you look at the seasonal variability is much larger than that storm. Same thing happens with drought. It isn't that you lost that much water because you lose it every summer. It's that you lost that over a period of time when you're not expecting to. And it's on top of these other cycles. There's a seasonal cycle with this great loss of water here. A lot of water coming in. So I think part of it is this question of, like with tides and sea level, it's this gradual change that causes then individual events to really exceed what we expect.
And I'll make a couple of comments. Hurricane frequency is not entirely random. For example, we have outlooks for hurricane seasons in advance, and this one was predicted to be more active than usual because of the combination of La Nina conditions developing in the tropical Pacific Ocean, which reduces wind shear, and also unusually warm temperatures in the tropical Atlantic, which favors storms. So they do tend to cluster, at least in that sense. And that turns out to be indeed very important for an impact on society, because ability to respond to one disaster is much greater than our ability to respond to multiple disasters, especially if they're right on their heels. We saw that this year with one hurricane taking out the northern Virgin Islands, and then 2 weeks later another hurricane taking out the southern Virgin Islands where the relief supplies were staged. So when they do come in clusters like this, it's much more damaging than if they're spread out.
Hi, Joel Achenbach, Washington Post. A question for Adrian. Tell us again how much water fell on Texas, like how many gallons? I think you said it was like 24 trillion. Tell us that and remind us, how much did it depress the land? And then a second question for Karin. Can you explain a little bit more about why this 15% figure is sort of twice as much as you would expect from the traditional model? And I'm not going to say I think it's Clausius-Kuiper that model, something like that. What's the dynamic that you'd see more rain coming down? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start. We see a peak, the rainfall total of 127 gigatons, which was the high end of his independent estimates, 34 trillion gallons. A gigaton is a cubic kilometer of water, so if you imagine a cubic kilometer sitting above a city, it's just this immense physical presence. I will say that unlike at least two of the other presentations here, we've not yet published. We've been doing a lot of the work over the last month, so that could change. We may be missing some of the water that actually arrives and is flowing off as the hurricane is stationary over the region. As for the GPS response, depending on where you are, it's anything from about a millimeter of subsidence up to a maximum. Certain stations hit somewhere around 1.5 centimeters. It depends on how you smooth the data. So GPS data are inherently kind of noisy. You have to get rid of, and we don't call it smoothing, as my co-author reminds me, we say we low-pass filter it. There's a certain content there that we may not be as comfortable with. Let's say daily changes every 5 minutes. There's a lot of things going on. Once you begin to smooth, then you capture what's going on behind the data. So around 1.5 centimeter maximum.
Yes, so our estimate was that global warming made this 15% more intense, and as Michael said, that's about twice as much as you would expect from Clausius-Clapeyron. And Clausius-Clapeyron is the thermodynamic response, so the amount of moisture that you expect to be additionally in the air for each degree of warming. The fact that it was twice Clausius-Clapeyron indicates that there's also dynamic changes, so changes to the weather or the forcing. In this case, so our study is purely the statistical side of this event, but it could be anything from the warm SSTs, because they were exceptionally warm, so more evaporation. The fact that the storm stalled for 3 days, so rather than it spreading out the rain over a larger area, it all fell in one place. The size of the storm, so it had a larger area to pick up water and drop it in one place. These are all weather-related things, dynamical changes that contribute to make this a really bad event. And they come together, they came together in a very bad way.
Next question over here.
Ellen Prager, freelance, and I just want to follow up something with you said. If any of you can make a comment on what the sea surface temperature was in the Gulf of Mexico, because you mentioned stalling and more moisture in the atmosphere. What about sea surface temperature in the Gulf? Any comment on that?
Yeah, those were warmer than normal. Numbers I've seen were on the order of 1 degree Celsius. It depends on where you look and how you average. But there was research presented by Kevin Trenberth yesterday, perhaps you'd be able to comment on it, that showed that over the depth of the Gulf of Mexico, it was remarkably warm.
Yeah, I think you might be interested in talking to Kevin about this. He used Argo floats, submersible floats in the Gulf of Mexico, to demonstrate that the amount of heat lost by the western Gulf of Mexico was almost identically equal to the heat released by the rain with the water condensed over Texas. So for the first time, we kind of know where the water came from, and it wouldn't surprise you to hear that it came from the western Gulf.
I would add that detection and attribution studies using the CMIP-5 models, the climate models in the coupled model intercomparison project, reveal that there's about a degree of attributable warming, degree centigrade attributable warming in the Gulf of Mexico.
Hi, I'm Mohi Kumar. I'm with EOS, the news arm of AGU. I'm also a Houston resident, and in addition to climate change's influence, our storm season has made me fascinated with drainage. So, wow, that was exciting. So my question actually is for Adrian on GPS loads. How fine is the network? In an urban environment, you don't have the soils that saturate, you just have open water. Is there any way to extract from that how urban environments drain versus how non-urban environments drain, or extract information on the built environment's effects on hydrology, or the signal's just too coarse?
So wow, that's a very interesting tack that we haven't considered. So it turns out that thanks to a big investment by the University of Houston, there's a very dense GPS network in the Houston region. We've not looked at that scale. One of the things we have to do to get the regional scale, where the stations are separated by sort of 25, 30 kilometers typically, we put a certain amount of smoothing into the model, and that smoothing results in good estimates at the 25 to 30 kilometer range. If you want to work on Houston, we would have to change our parameters and really focus on what's going on right there. But that's interesting. I think there may be something to those data. We just haven't looked at it yet.
Okay, next question.
Rob Meyer with The Atlantic. It seems, so we're all here, it seems like there's a lot of public utility to detection and attribution, and that we can say this, you know, climate change affected these storms, which you heard about and you saw this way. This is to any of the three authors who conducted detection and attribution studies. What's the scientific utility going forward of building up a literature like this? Or do you think it's mostly that now we all know kind of this fact about how climate change affected these phenomena?
That's a good question that we get all the time. And you know, to be quite frank, one of the reasons to do detection and attribution make attribution statements about individual events is because the public wants to know. You know, they want to know, you know, did climate change affect the fact that my house got flooded? And I think that's a fine motivation for doing these studies. But I think it goes beyond that, in that, you know, in these studies that our three independent groups have done, the answers were not what we would have predicted just, you know, using back of the envelope kind of intuition. And so there's insight that we gain about, in this case, the dynamical processes that Karin just referred to. You know, what are those processes? You know, we're not going to know until we go back with complex dynamical models and simulate these storms many, many times on the biggest computers we can get our hands on. So I think, you know, it's not just about being in the news, although there is some part of that. It's also about understanding these storms so that we can make better projections of how they will behave in the future.
Okay, next question. It's on.
It is on. Chris Mooney with the Washington Post. There's just one thing I'm still struggling getting my mind around. I'm not clear on whether you are talking about the probability of the event just as rainfall, or if anyone is talking about the probability of the strange track, or if you're sort of combining them together in a way, or separating them out. Do you understand what I'm asking? Because obviously the event arises from both in combination.
Well, the rainfall is a product of multiple factors, including the track. So in a sense, if the track wasn't unusual, the rainfall wouldn't have been unusual either. So the attribution studies that have been presented here are based upon the rainfall, and the unusualness of the rainfall includes, to some extent, the unusualness of the track. And so my research focused specifically on how unusual the track was.
I'll add that in our study is really about the rainfall event. So 3-day rainfall total to exceed the 1,000 millimeters observed. because for impacts and for flooding, this is what was the driver. And I would like to add that a third of the big extreme rainfall events on the US Gulf Coast are not due to hurricanes or tropical cyclones. And that's both in the observations and in our models. And so if you just focus on tropical cyclones, then you miss 1/3 of the big rainfall events that are also going to cause huge impacts.
I think this also ties in with the previous question. Is that's one of the reasons why we need to do these studies, to untangle those two parts of the question.
Okay, well, that's our time. That's our time. So we're going to take a quick 15-minute break and reconvene for part 2 at 3:30. Thank you to our panelists.